On a September afternoon, when the light fell golden through the elms, St. Agnes' House opened its gardens for the annual Harvest Festival, and the village of Little Wickham came dutifully to admire, to purchase, and to observe. Miss Jane Marple, settled comfortably in a wicker chair beneath the ancient oak, watched the familiar dance of village life unfold with that gentle attention which had always seen more than it pretended. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she observed Mrs. Bantry's determined cheerfulness at the jam stall, Colonel Weatherby's unsuccessful attempts to interest anyone in his prize marrows, and young Dr. Haydock making polite conversation while clearly wishing himself elsewhere. It was, she reflected, rather like watching a well-rehearsed play, though one could never be quite certain when someone might forget their lines. The convent itself provided an intriguing backdrop to the festivities. Once a grand manor house, it had been home to the Sisters of St. Agnes for nearly 30 years, though their numbers had dwindled to merely 6 elderly nuns who maintained the gardens, taught the village children, and offered what Mother Superior delicately termed spiritual guidance for modern times. The villagers regarded them with that mixture of respect and mild curiosity reserved for those who had chosen a path so thoroughly removed from ordinary concerns. They were, in their quiet way, woven into the fabric of village life, yet remained somehow apart from it. The most fascinating of these sisters, at least to the casual observer, was Sister Mildred, known throughout the village as the Silent Nun. Each year she undertook a vow of complete silence during the month of September, speaking to no one except in the direst emergency. She sat now beside a table laden with exquisite lacework and small bottles of lavender water, her hands folded serenely in her lap, her eyes cast modestly downward. Visitors approached her stall with hushed voices as though her silence were contagious, and came away feeling somehow edified by the encounter. Miss Marple found herself watching the nun with particular interest, noting the way her fingers occasionally moved as though counting invisible beads, and how her gaze, though lowered, seemed to track the movements of certain individuals with surprising attention. Mother Superior, a woman whose composure had been earned through decades of managing both spiritual and temporal concerns, moved gracefully among the guests, her bell-like voice offering gentle encouragement to potential purchasers. Miss Blackshaw, the convent's formidable bursar, followed in her wake with ledger and pen, recording each transaction with the precision of a military quartermaster. The contrast between the two women was striking, one all spiritual serenity, the other sharp-eyed practicality, yet Miss Marple sensed an underlying tension between them, the kind that develops when two strong personalities must work closely together despite fundamental differences in approach. Among the villagers, several faces drew Miss Marple's particular attention. Mr. Neville Pargeter, the antique dealer, lingered near a display of religious artifacts with the hungry look of a man who saw profit in piety. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in purple silk, pronounced loudly on the virtue of religious dedication while examining the price tags with obvious calculation. Young Tom Pollard from the post office hovered near Ivy Simpkins, the convent's newest employee, who blushed furiously each time he approached her tea stand. Dr. Rowan, recently arrived to assist the aging Dr. Haydock, checked his watch frequently and started whenever the convent bell chimed the quarter hours. At precisely 4 o'clock, Mother Superior rang a small silver bell, and the gentle murmur of conversation stilled. "My dear friends," she announced, "we shall now draw our raffle, after which Mr. Pargeter has kindly agreed to speak about our treasured painting of St. Agnes, which has hung in our chapel since the convent's founding." There was that pleasant rustle of anticipation that accompanies such moments in village life, punctuated by the distant sound of children playing and the soft cooing of doves from the convent's dovecote. The raffle proceeded with the usual mixture of genuine pleasure and good-natured disappointment. Tom Pollard won the fruitcake and tried unsuccessfully to hide his delight, while Ivy served him tea with trembling hands. Miss Blackshaw's ledger grew satisfyingly thick with entries. Sister Mildred remained motionless throughout, a figure of such perfect stillness that she might have been carved from stone. Then, just as Mr. Pargeter stepped forward to begin his talk, a thin cry pierced the afternoon calm, the sort of sound a bird might make when caught in a snare. Ivy stood in the doorway of the convent's main building, her face white as her apron, one hand pressed to her throat. "Mother Superior," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the sudden silence. "Please come quickly. It's Sister Mildred in the chapel. Something's terribly wrong." They moved as one toward the ancient stone building, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the sudden hush. The chapel door stood ajar, revealing a rectangle of golden light that seemed somehow ominous rather than welcoming. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her knitting forgotten, her mild blue eyes sharp with the particular attention she reserved for moments when the ordinary world revealed its hidden complexities. In her experience, when silence was broken so dramatically, it usually meant that someone had found their voice at precisely the wrong moment, or had been permanently silenced at exactly the right one. The chapel of St. Agnes' House possessed that particular quality of hushed reverence that comes with centuries of prayer, but the silence that greeted the small procession was of an entirely different nature. "Mother." Superior crossed herself before stepping through the doorway, her composed demeanor intact despite the urgency of the moment. Dr. Haydock followed closely, his medical bag already in hand, while Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the scene within and the reactions of those gathered outside, noting with interest how each face revealed its owner's character in that unguarded moment when shock strips away social pretense. Sister Mildred sat slumped forward in the front pew, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her usually serene hands now lying slack in her lap. The wooden rosary that had been her constant companion lay broken beside her, its cord snapped in two places, with a single dark bead having rolled beneath the pew into shadow. Dr. Haydock approached with professional caution, his fingers seeking the pulse that was not there, his examination brief but thorough. When he straightened, his expression was grave. "She's gone," he announced quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stone-walled space. "Appears to have been dead for some time, though the cause—" He paused, glancing meaningfully toward the assembled crowd. "I'll need to examine her properly before making any pronouncements." The reaction among the villagers was immediate and varied, each response revealing character as clearly as a signature. Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly that such things simply didn't happen at church functions, as though her indignation could reverse the situation through sheer force of will. Colonel Weatherby muttered about the shocking state of the world, while young Tom Pollard went quite pale and sat heavily on the chapel steps, prompting Ivy to abandon her tea-urn and rush to his side with motherly concern. Miss Blackshaw's reaction proved most interesting to Miss Marple's observant eye. The bursar stood rigid in the doorway, her ledger clutched against her chest like armor, her face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and something that might have been relief before settling into appropriate grief. Miss Marple, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood that haste obscured more than it revealed, took in the small details that others, concerned with larger matters, did not see. The hymn book on the lectern was opened not to the afternoon psalm but to "Lead, Kindly Light," and a small white cup on a nearby pew still held traces of lavender water. Most intriguing was the rope of the sanctuary bell, lying in a loose curve against the wall as though a hand had let it fall halfway through a thought. On closer inspection, Sister Mildred's fingers bore the faintest shimmer, as if she had recently handled something newly varnished or gilt, and Miss Marple's eyes traveled to the painting of St. Agnes on the side wall, noting that the lower right corner of its gilded frame bore a fresh smudge. The arrival of Inspector Bryce from the county town brought a new dynamic to the gathering. A spare, tidy man. With the expression of someone who was often disappointed but never surprised, he surveyed the scene with professional detachment. His preliminary questions were routine. When had Sister Mildred last been seen alive? Who had discovered her? Whether anyone had noticed anything unusual? But Miss Marple observed how the answers came with subtle variations that suggested not everyone was being entirely forthcoming. Ivy's account, though tearful, was already circulating. She had gone to fetch Sister Mildred for Mr. Pargeter's talk, found the chapel door ajar, and discovered the nun slumped in prayer position. As the inspector began establishing procedures, the village transformed into a hive of speculation and unease. Mr. Pargeter, having recovered his composure, whispered to a small group that he'd always found Sister Mildred's vigilance over the chapel's artifacts rather excessive, his gaze returning repeatedly to the valuable religious pieces adorning the walls. Mrs. Bantry wondered aloud whether they should all leave immediately, while Dr. Rowan, the younger physician, stood apart beneath the yew tree, his eyes fixed on the convent's bell tower with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the architectural interest it might hold. The theories emerged with startling rapidity. Colonel Weatherby immediately suspected foreign elements, while others whispered about domestic troubles or grudges against the convent. Some suggested that Sister Mildred's month of silence had been hiding something significant, while Mrs. Price Ridley declared that no one from their village could possibly be responsible for such an act against a woman of God. Through it all, Miss Marple listened with the gentle attention that had always seen more than it pretended, noting how quickly people turned to character assassination or sought to distance themselves from the crime by casting blame upon convenient scapegoats. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the convent grounds, Miss Marple settled back with her knitting, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. What had begun as a perfectly ordinary village gathering had transformed into something far more complex, and she reflected that in her considerable experience, when death visited such gatherings, it rarely came alone. The silence that had defined Sister Mildred's September vow might well prove to have been more significant than anyone yet realized, and the broken rosary at her feet suggested that even the most sacred vows could be shattered by the right pressure applied at precisely the wrong moment. Evening descended upon Little Wickham with the sort of careful neatness that suggested the village believed itself immune to the disorder of the wider world, yet the harvest festival had scattered disquieting seeds that now took root in parlors and kitchens where teacups were set down more thoughtfully than usual. Inspector Bryce, practical and methodical, had established his temporary headquarters in the convent's small parlor, where a plain crucifix hung above an uncompromisingly hard sofa. He preferred it that way. Comfort, he always felt, encouraged elaboration rather than truth. Miss Marple had accepted Mother Superior's invitation to remain for supper, ostensibly to provide comfort during such trying circumstances, though her mild blue eyes missed nothing as the investigation unfolded with bureaucratic precision. The inspector's preliminary examination proceeded with systematic thoroughness, beginning with the establishment of timelines and the identification of everyone present at the time of discovery. Dr. Haydock's initial assessment suggested natural causes, perhaps heart failure, but Inspector Bryce's raised eyebrow indicated he wasn't prepared to accept such a convenient explanation for a death occurring under these particular circumstances. Dr. Rowan, the younger physician, offered his assistance with an eagerness that seemed less about medical duty and more about proximity to the unfolding drama. His frequent glances toward the chapel suggesting concerns that extended beyond professional interest. Miss Marple, having retrieved her knitting, found a strategic position on a bench just outside the chapel where she could observe the comings and goings without appearing to intrude. Her needles clicked a quiet counterpoint to hushed conversations and the rustle of official papers, while her experienced eye catalogued the subtle tremors beneath the surface of village life. She watched Miss Blackshaw hovering near Mother Superior, their low-voiced conversation carrying an edge of persistent argument that suggested pre-existing friction exacerbated by tragedy. Mother Superior, usually the epitome of serene composure, seemed to be exercising considerable restraint, her hands clasped tightly before her in a manner that spoke of barely controlled tension. The refectory supper had revealed fascinating dynamics within the convent walls. The remaining 5 sisters moved through their evening routine with mechanical precision, their prayers more fervent than usual, their glances toward Sister Mildred's empty chair, both sorrowful and somehow furtive. Sister Catherine's repeated loud inquiries about the absent nun's whereabouts distressed the others with each explanation, while Sister Joan picked at her food with obvious agitation. Most intriguing was Sister Elizabeth, whose duties included maintaining the chapel and its precious artifacts. She ate with the methodical determination of someone forcing herself through necessary tasks, her eyes never quite meeting those of her companions. During this time, Miss Marple had made several quiet observations that the official investigation might overlook. The chapel, when she'd taken a moment to sit in Sister Mildred's customary pew, had revealed subtle details. A thin flake of gold leaf near the molding, still bearing traces of tackiness. A pale thread of blue cotton snagged on an almost invisible splinter at the pew's far end. The bell rope lying in its careless loop, dusted with chalk that had transferred to her glove upon examination. The hymn book remained open to "Lead, Kindly Light," a hymn of comfort and guidance often chosen in times of distress, while the small cup of lavender water suggested someone had required, or offered, restorative comfort. The villagers, meanwhile, had transformed into a symphony of ill-concealed curiosity and nervous conjecture. Mrs. Price Ridley, having exhausted her supply of righteous indignation, now theorized about disgruntled former employees, while Colonel Weatherby insisted with considerable gusto that a clandestine society of bell ringers was responsible. Mr. Pargeter, despite the solemnity of the occasion, continued to direct meaningful glances toward the chapel's altar, where valuable religious icons were displayed. His earlier comments about Sister Mildred's vigilance over the artifacts now carrying different implications entirely. Young Tom Pollard remained pale and shaken, keeping his arm protectively around Ivy Simpkins, who seemed strangely reluctant to meet anyone's eye, particularly the inspector's. Her initial account of discovering Sister Mildred had been delivered with breathless haste, almost as if she were trying to get the words out before second thoughts could intervene. Miss Marple wondered whether Ivy had seen more than she revealed, or perhaps understood less than she felt she should. As darkness settled over the convent grounds, Miss Marple excused herself for a constitutional around the gardens, her real purpose being to observe the buildings from different angles. The chapel windows glowed softly from within, where Inspector Bryce continued his examination, but what drew her particular attention was a light in an upper window of the main building. A room Mother Superior had mentioned was used for storage, but which seemed occupied by someone moving about with considerable purpose. Her circuit brought an unexpected encounter with Dr. Rowan standing beside the newest grave in the small cemetery, his startled reaction seeming disproportionate to a chance meeting. His hasty explanation about taking evening air carried the hollow ring of improvised excuse, particularly given the small leather notebook he quickly tucked into his coat pocket. Returning toward the main building, she encountered Mr. Pargeter examining the chapel's exterior wall with a small electric torch, ostensibly checking for structural damage that might have contributed to Sister Mildred's collapse. Yet his attention focused not on the walls themselves, but on windows that provided views of the interior and its valuable contents. When Miss Marple mentioned the light in the storage room, his immediate upward glance, followed by hasty deflection, suggested knowledge he preferred to keep private. The broken rosary, the opened hymn book, the smudged gilt frame, the mysterious activities after dark. Each detail might prove insignificant in isolation, yet together they suggested a pattern that spoke not of peaceful prayer interrupted by natural death, but of careful planning disrupted by unexpected discovery. Miss Marple reflected that, in her considerable experience, when death visited such gatherings, it rarely came alone. and the silence that had defined Sister Mildred's September vow might well prove to have been more significant than anyone yet realized. The morning brought Inspector Bryce back to St. Agnes' house with the methodical determination of a man who had spent the night organizing facts into a coherent theory. The mist that clung to the convent's ancient stones seemed to mirror the fog of suspicion now settling over the village, though Miss Marple observed from her breakfast-room window that clarity often emerged not from the lifting of such veils, but from learning to see through them. The inspector's renewed focus on the chapel, accompanied by a constable whose notebook remained conspicuously ready, suggested that preliminary investigations had yielded results worth pursuing with greater intensity. Dr. Haydock's more thorough examination had indeed provided disturbing revelations. Sister Mildred's death, while technically from heart failure, showed signs of external influence that transformed a natural conclusion into something requiring criminal investigation. The positioning of her body indicated movement after death, while faint bruising on her wrists suggested restraint rather than peaceful collapse. Most significantly, traces of digitalis had been detected in her system, a substance absent from both her medical history and the convent's medicine cabinet, yet readily available to anyone with botanical knowledge or medical training. These findings crystallized Inspector Bryce's suspicions around Mr. Neville Pargeter, whose expertise in antiques and obvious financial difficulties provided both means and motive for theft gone tragically wrong. The discovery of a thin-bladed knife near the chapel, bearing traces of gilt sizing and clearly intended for delicate framework, seemed to point directly toward the antique dealer. His access to such tools, combined with his repeated examinations of the chapel's valuable artifacts and his inability to account satisfactorily for crucial minutes during the afternoon, created a compelling case that satisfied both official logic and village prejudice. The evidence against Pargeter accumulated with convenient precision. Gold dust found in his coat pocket matched samples from the damaged frame, while his torchlit activities after the discovery suggested guilty knowledge rather than innocent concern. His heated argument with Sister Mildred 2 days prior regarding a valuable reliquary he had sought to acquire for what Mother Superior termed a paltry sum provided clear motive for confrontation. The village, eager for resolution, embraced this obvious solution with the relief of people who preferred their mysteries solved rather than pondered. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying the case with the gentle skepticism that had served her well through decades of observing human nature. While Pargeter certainly possessed the knowledge and opportunity for theft, the subtleties of the crime seemed inconsistent with his character. The broken rosary spoke of struggle or frustration, yet Pargeter was a man of calculated precision who would hardly risk damaging valuable items through violence. The chalk dust on the bell rope, which she had observed with such interest, seemed more consistent with lace-making than antique dealing, while the blue cotton thread snagged on the pew matched Ivy Simpkins' apron rather than Pargeter's impeccable tweed. Dr. Rowan's behavior continued to intrigue her observant eye. His medical knowledge provided obvious means for administering digitalis, while his nervous energy and frequent consultations of that mysterious leather notebook suggested concerns extending beyond professional duty. His presence in the cemetery with such unconvincing explanations, combined with his eager offers of assistance that seemed motivated by curiosity rather than helpfulness, marked him as someone bearing closer observation than the inspector's Pargeter-focused investigation currently provided. Miss Blackshaw's reactions proved equally fascinating under the pressure of official scrutiny. Her initial relief at yesterday's events had transformed into something approaching panic as questions intensified, particularly regarding financial records and her access to various keys and storage areas. The bursar's protests about perfectly ordered accounts carried the desperate edge of someone whose careful constructions were beginning to crumble under unwelcome attention, while her inability to immediately produce certain ledgers raised obvious questions about what those documents might reveal. Ivy Simpkins remained pale and increasingly evasive as her initial account underwent more detailed examination. Her timeline showed troubling gaps that her explanations about fetching supplies could not adequately fill, particularly when Mother Superior confirmed that all necessary items had been prepared that morning. Most disturbing was her reaction to the broken rosary, a moment of clear recognition quickly suppressed, followed by vehement denials that seemed to protest rather too much for complete believability. The storage room that had shown mysterious activity continued to resist investigation, with Miss Blackshaw claiming to have mislaid the key in a manner that seemed remarkably convenient. When Inspector Bryce insisted on immediate access, the discovered papers showed signs of recent disturbance, with Sister Mildred's distinctive marginalia suggesting she had been conducting her own investigation into financial discrepancies between recorded donations and actual deposits. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the convent grounds, Miss Marple reflected on the curious tendency of obvious solutions to obscure more complex truths. In her considerable experience, when death visited such gatherings, it rarely announced itself through convenient evidence and clear motives. The digitalis, the financial irregularities, the multiple individuals with access and opportunity, all suggested a more intricate web of deception than simple theft interrupted by an inconvenient witness. The broken rosary, the opened hymn book, the smudged frame and the mysterious nighttime activities each told part of a story that extended beyond Pargeter's obvious guilt. Miss Marple suspected that Sister Mildred's month of silence had been more significant than anyone yet realized, and that her death might well prove to be not the unfortunate conclusion of a botched theft, but the calculated silencing of someone who had discovered truths that others desperately needed to remain hidden. The morning brought Inspector Bryce back to St. Agnes' house with renewed determination, his methodical mind having spent the night arranging facts into what he considered a satisfactory pattern. The mist that clung to the convent's ancient stones seemed to mirror the fog of suspicion now settling over the investigation, though Miss Marple observed from her position near the chapel entrance that clarity often emerged not from the lifting of such veils, but from learning to see through them with patience and careful attention to details others might overlook. Dr. Haydock's more thorough post-mortem examination had indeed provided disturbing revelations that transformed Sister Mildred's death from natural causes into something requiring criminal investigation. While technically resulting from heart failure, the presence of digitalis in her system, a substance absent from both her medical history and the convent's medicine cabinet, suggested deliberate administration rather than accidental ingestion. The positioning of her body indicated movement after death, while faint bruising on her wrists suggested restraint rather than peaceful collapse during prayer. These findings had crystallized Inspector Bryce's suspicions around Mr. Neville Pargeter, whose expertise with valuable artifacts and obvious financial difficulties provided both means and motive for theft, interrupted by an inconvenient witness. The discovery of gold dust in his coat pocket, combined with his inability to account satisfactorily for crucial minutes during the festival, created what the inspector considered a compelling case that satisfied both official logic and village prejudice against outsiders who dealt in sacred objects for profit. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying the accumulating evidence with the gentle skepticism that had served her well through decades of observing human nature's more complex manifestations. While examining Sister Mildred's customary pew with the excuse of adjusting a slipped kneeler, she discovered a tiny pin with a red glass head wedged almost invisibly at the shadow's edge. The pin's shaft bore traces of what appeared to be gilding size, while a delicate scent clung to it, mint-sweet and medicinal, the ghost of a peppermint lozenge carelessly handled. She placed the pin carefully in her knitting bag, noting how such small implements were typically used for fine lacework rather than ordinary mending. Her subsequent visit to the lace-making room beyond the refectory proved illuminating in ways that extended far beyond appreciation for handicraft. Sister Catherine and Sister Elizabeth worked before pillows flowered with bobbins, their fingers moving with hypnotic precision while blue chalk dusted everything like frost. When Miss Marple admired their delicate insertions and mentioned the missing pin, Sister Catherine frowned with genuine concern. "I had 3 of those red-headed pins. My cousin sent them from Bruges, but one has gone missing. I thought it might have rolled away, as pins do, but we've searched thoroughly." The significance of this loss, combined with the pin's discovery in the chapel, suggested movements and activities that had not been part of any official account. The sacristy yielded equally intriguing observations during Miss Marple's gentle exploration. Among the bottles of lavender water, rose water, and oil of wintergreen stood one whose label sat slightly crooked, its cork stained by a faint ring suggesting the liquid beneath was not altogether as it should be. Lavender water ought to be clear as thin glass, yet when light caught this particular bottle, there was a cloudiness, a milky whisper that spoke of adulteration or contamination. Sister Elizabeth's defensive explanation that they never used lavender for drinking seemed to protest rather too much, particularly given the small white cup that had appeared on yesterday's pew. Ivy Simpkins's behavior under gentle questioning revealed layers of anxiety that extended beyond simple grief over Sister Mildred's death. Her apron pocket contained blue threads matching those found snagged in the chapel, while her forefinger bore a greenish stain that would not wash away with ordinary scrubbing. When Miss Marple mentioned that gardening could be cruel to hands, Ivy's explanation came with nervous haste. "The foxgloves. We moved them from the border last week. Dr. Rowan said they were too near the children's play path." Her flush suggested awareness that she had revealed more than intended, while her mention of Dr. Rowan's botanical concerns added another thread to the increasingly complex pattern. Dr. Rowan himself, encountered crossing the corridor with a ledger under his arm, displayed the particular nervousness of someone whose helpful nature had led him into deeper waters than anticipated. His explanation about advising on garden safety carried the hollow ring of improvised excuse, while his involuntary glance toward the bell rope suggested knowledge he preferred to keep private. Most intriguing was his habit of providing peppermint lozenges to Ivy for her nerves, the same mint-sweet scent that had clung to the discovered pin, and might well explain the medicinal traces found in the chapel. The opened storage room, when Miss Blackshaw finally produced the mysteriously mislaid key, revealed signs of recent disturbance beyond the ledgers that had captured Inspector Bryce's attention. A slip of paper wedged beneath a box bore penciled figures corrected multiple times in a trembling hand, while on its reverse someone had written lavender and underlined it twice. Most significantly, a devotional book lay open with a dull, leathery leaf pressed in its gutter, the sort of botanical specimen a careful woman might keep as reference for a plant requiring watchful attention. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the convent grounds, Miss Marple reflected on the curious tendency of obvious solutions to obscure more complex truths. The evidence against Pargeter, while superficially compelling, failed to account for the subtle signs of systematic planning that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the convent's routines and access to its resources. The broken rosary, the opened hymn book, the tampered lavender water, and the various botanical connections all pointed toward a more intricate web of deception than simple theft interrupted by an inconvenient witness. In her considerable experience, when death visited such gatherings, it rarely announced itself through convenient evidence and clear motives. Sister Mildred's month of silence had clearly been more significant than anyone yet realized, and her death might well prove to be not the unfortunate conclusion of a botched theft, but the calculated silencing of someone who had discovered truths that others desperately needed to remain hidden within the convent's seemingly peaceful walls. The morning brought Inspector Bryce to the convent's austere parlor with the methodical determination of a man who believed that systematic questioning could untangle any web of deception, no matter how carefully woven. He had arranged the hard-backed chairs beneath the crucifix with military precision, creating an atmosphere of formal interrogation that seemed to strip away the gentle courtesies that usually governed village interactions. Miss Marple, having accepted Mother Superior's invitation to remain for moral support, positioned herself near the window with her knitting, where she could observe both the proceedings within and the nervous gatherings of villagers in the courtyard beyond. Mr. Pargeter entered first, his usual composure somewhat frayed by a sleepless night and the weight of obvious suspicion. Under Inspector Bryce's methodical questioning, he presented his case with the practiced precision of a man accustomed to defending his professional reputation. He admitted readily to his expertise with gilt frames and his possession of the thin-bladed tools found near the chapel, explaining that such implements were standard equipment for anyone in the antique restoration trade. The gold dust discovered in his coat pocket, he insisted, came from a recent project involving a medieval altarpiece, not from any tampering with the St. Agnes painting. His inability to account precisely for his movements during the crucial afternoon hours stemmed not from guilty conscience but from his habit of conducting discreet valuations of religious artifacts, a practice he preferred not to advertise to their current owners. Miss Marple observed with interest how Pargeter's indignation seemed genuine rather than calculated, particularly when he protested that a man of his experience would never risk damaging valuable items through violence or struggle. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, but the tremor seemed to speak more of wounded pride than criminal guilt. The broken rosary, he pointed out with considerable logic, would have represented a loss of value to any thief, making its destruction counterproductive to the very motive Inspector Bryce attributed to him. The questioning of Miss Blackshaw revealed far more damaging territory. The convent's bursar faced Inspector Bryce's inquiries about financial irregularities with the brittle composure of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble under sustained pressure. Her explanations for the missing ledgers grew increasingly elaborate, transforming from simple misplacement to complex filing reorganization to temporary removal for audit preparation. When confronted with Sister Mildred's penciled annotations regarding donation discrepancies, Miss Blackshaw's face flushed with an anger that seemed disproportionate to mere bookkeeping criticism. She dismissed the dead nun's observations as fanciful interpretations from a woman whose silence had given her too much time for suspicious thinking. But her defensive protestations carried the hollow ring of someone whose secrets had been uncomfortably exposed. Dr. Rowan's interview proved equally revealing, though in ways that extended beyond his obvious medical knowledge of digitals. His nervous energy, barely contained behind a façade of professional helpfulness, betrayed itself in small gestures. The frequent checking of his pocket watch, the unconscious fingering of the small tin of peppermint lozenges he carried, the way his eyes kept returning to the window that overlooked the convent's botanical gardens. When Inspector Bryce questioned him about his botanical interests and his advice regarding the dangerous foxgloves, Dr. Rowan's explanations came with the practiced fluency of someone who had rehearsed his responses. Yet his obvious anxiety suggested concerns that extended far beyond professional liability for garden safety recommendations. Miss Marple's own quiet observations during these proceedings yielded details that the formal investigation might have overlooked. Ivy Simpkins, hovering anxiously in the corridor between interviews, displayed the greenish stain on her fingers that she claimed came from moving the foxgloves. Yet the mark's persistence, despite obvious scrubbing, suggested more extensive contact with the plant than a simple gardening task would require. The blue threads continuing to escape from her apron provided a direct link to the chapel evidence, while her flustered explanations about bell-ringing protocols revealed knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her brief employment at the convent. The examination of the tampered lavender water bottle provided crucial evidence when Dr. Haydick's analysis revealed not only digitalis, but traces of the peppermint oil that Dr. Rowan distributed so freely in his medicinal lozenges. The method of administration became clear. Someone with botanical knowledge had dissolved the poison in the sweetened oil, then added it to what Sister Mildred would have assumed was her customary afternoon restorative. The small white cup found in the chapel contained residual traces that confirmed this theory, while the timing suggested intimate knowledge of the nun's daily routines and habits. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern emerging from the accumulating evidence. The financial irregularities Miss Blackshaw so desperately defended, the botanical expertise Dr. Rowan possessed, and Ivy's suspicious access to restricted areas all pointed toward a conspiracy more complex than simple theft, interrupted by an inconvenient witness. Sister Mildred's month of silence had clearly been more significant than anyone initially realized, providing her with the opportunity to observe and document activities that others assumed remained hidden beneath the convent's peaceful routines. The broken rosary, the carefully positioned body, and the opened hymn book all suggested a killer who retained some vestige of respect for religious observance even while committing the ultimate violation of its principles. Yet the systematic nature of the poisoning spoke to careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The evening brought an unsettling quiet to St. Agnes' house, the kind of silence that follows revelations too disturbing to discuss openly, yet too significant to ignore. Inspector Bryce had departed with promises to return at first light, his confidence in the Pargeter theory somewhat shaken by the accumulating evidence of inside knowledge and careful planning that the antique dealer simply could not possess. Miss Marple, having accepted Mother Superior's invitation to remain overnight, given the late hour and disturbing circumstances, found herself unable to sleep despite the comfortable guest room's peaceful atmosphere. It was nearly midnight when she heard the soft footsteps in the corridor outside her door, followed by the gentle closing of what sounded like the chapel door. Her experience had taught her that midnight activities in places of recent tragedy rarely involved innocent purposes. So she wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and ventured quietly into the moonlit corridors of the convent. The ancient stones seemed to whisper secrets as she made her way toward the chapel, guided by a faint light that flickered through the stained glass windows like a candle flame dancing in uncertain air. What she discovered there provided the missing piece that had eluded Inspector Bryce's methodical investigation. Sister Elizabeth knelt before the altar, but her posture spoke of desperation rather than devotion. In her hands, she held a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with Sister Mildred's distinctive handwriting, and she was systematically tearing out pages and feeding them to the flame of a votive candle. The light revealed tears streaming down her face as she destroyed what was clearly Sister Mildred's private journal, the very document that would have explained everything about the financial irregularities, the botanical experiments, and the growing web of deception that had ultimately led to murder. Miss Marple remained in the shadows, observing with the patience that had served her well through decades of understanding human nature at its most complex moments. Sister Elizabeth's actions revealed not guilt, but protective love. She was destroying evidence that would implicate someone she cared about deeply, someone whose welfare mattered more to her than justice for Sister Mildred or her own spiritual integrity. The pages curled and blackened as they burned, taking with them Sister Mildred's careful observations about the systematic theft of medicinal supplies, the unauthorized use of the convent's herb garden for extracting dangerous compounds, and the financial manipulations that had been funding these activities. When Sister Elizabeth finally noticed Miss Marple's presence, her reaction was neither surprise nor fear, but rather a profound relief, as though the burden of her secret knowledge had grown too heavy to bear alone. Through whispered confessions punctuated by tears, the truth emerged with heartbreaking clarity. Dr. Rowan had indeed been using the convent's resources for his own purposes, but not for personal gain. His previous practice had ended in scandal when several elderly patients died from medication errors that were actually mercy killings performed at their own desperate requests. His arrival in Little Wickham had been an attempt to start fresh, but his compassionate nature had led him down the same path. When Sister Agatha, the eldest nun, had begged him to help end her suffering from painful terminal illness. The digitalis had been prepared for Sister Agatha, not Sister Mildred, but Sister Mildred's careful observations during her month of silence had uncovered the plan. Her broken rosary told the story of a confrontation in the chapel where she had tried to prevent what she saw as both murder and suicide, a violation of everything she held sacred. In the struggle, the poison had been administered accidentally, and Dr. Rowan's attempt to revive her had failed. The staging of the scene, the positioning of the body, the opened hymn book, all had been desperate attempts to make her death appear natural and peaceful rather than the tragic accident it had become. Sister Elizabeth's involvement had been limited to helping dispose of the evidence and providing Dr. Rowan with alibis, motivated not by romantic attachment but by her own experience with watching beloved sisters suffer needlessly in their final days. The blue threads, the chalk dust, the various botanical clues, all had been the result of her nervous attempts to clean up after a tragedy she felt partially responsible for enabling. Ivy Simpkins' behavior reflected her growing suspicion that something was amiss, while Miss Blackshaw's financial irregularities were genuine but unrelated to the murder, simply another secret the convent had been harboring. As dawn approached and the last pages of Sister Mildred's journal crumbled to ash, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of good intentions leading to such devastating consequences. Dr. Rowan's compassionate desire to ease suffering had created a situation where an innocent woman died trying to prevent what she saw as a mortal sin. The complex web of relationships and secrets within the convent walls demonstrated once again that the most dangerous situations often arose not from evil intentions, but from the collision of different moral frameworks, each sincerely held but ultimately incompatible. The approaching footsteps in the corridor announced that their midnight conference would soon be discovered, and Miss Marple knew that the morning would bring difficult choices about justice, mercy, and the proper balance between protecting the living and honoring the dead. Sister Mildred's silence had indeed been more significant than anyone realized, and her death had revealed truths that would forever change the peaceful community of St. Agnes House. The morning found Miss Marple in the convent's small parlor, her knitting needles moving with unusual deliberation as she contemplated the night's revelations and their implications for justice, mercy, and the delicate balance between protecting the living and honoring the dead. Sister Elizabeth's midnight confession had provided crucial pieces of the puzzle, yet Miss Marple understood that truth revealed in darkness and desperation required careful verification in daylight before it could guide any course of action. Inspector Bryce's imminent return with warrants and reinforcements meant that time was running short for the kind of gentle investigation that had always served her better than official procedures. Her opportunity arose when Mother Superior, genuinely concerned about the emotional state of her community, suggested that a quiet gathering over morning tea might provide comfort to those most shaken by recent events. Miss Marple accepted this invitation with the gracious enthusiasm of someone whose primary concern was pastoral care, though her mild blue eyes held the particular sharpness that indicated more systematic purposes. She arranged herself in the refectory with strategic positioning near the window, where natural light would illuminate faces and reactions, while her knitting bag contained several items that might prove useful for testing the truthfulness of previous accounts. When Inspector Bryce arrived with Dr. Haydock and his preliminary reports, he found what appeared to be an impromptu support gathering rather than a formal investigation. Mr. Pargeter sat with wounded dignity, still protesting his innocence with the indignation of a man whose professional reputation had been unfairly maligned. Miss Blackshaw consulted her ledgers with mechanical precision, though her usual brisk efficiency seemed forced and brittle. Dr. Rowan appeared haggard and hollow-eyed, his medical bag clutched with white knuckles, while Sister Elizabeth moved through the domestic rituals with careful composure that spoke of tremendous effort. Ivy Simpkins hovered anxiously near the tea service, her movements betraying the nervous energy of someone carrying secrets too heavy for her slight frame. Miss Marple began her gentle probing with seemingly innocent observations about the chapel's restoration needs and the importance of preserving sacred artifacts for future generations. When she produced the red-headed pin from her knitting bag, wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief, Sister Catherine's immediate recognition, followed by her quick glance toward Sister Elizabeth, provided the first telling reaction. The pin's significance became clearer when Miss Marple mentioned its discovery near Sister Mildred's customary pew, along with traces of what appeared to be gilding size that suggested someone had been examining the valuable frame with more than casual interest. The discussion of the tampered lavender water bottle proved even more revealing. Miss Marple's gentle questions about the convent's medicinal supplies and the proper labeling of such bottles drew increasingly defensive responses from multiple quarters. Dr. Rowan's involuntary reach for his tin of peppermint lozenges, followed by his obvious effort to keep his hands still, provided a clear connection between his nervous habits and the mint-scented traces found at the scene. Miss Blackshaw's insistence that all bottles were properly maintained carried the brittle edge of someone whose careful systems had been compromised by circumstances beyond her control. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple, with apparent casualness, mentioned Sister Mildred's habit of keeping detailed observations during her month of silence and the possibility that such records might have survived, despite the unfortunate incident with papers near the chapel's votive candles. Dr. Rowan's reaction was immediate and damning. A visible tremor passed through his entire frame while his face drained of color as he recognized the implications of documented evidence regarding his activities. His medical bag slipped from nerveless fingers, spilling its contents across the stone floor and revealing among the standard instruments a small vial of clear liquid whose cork bore the telltale staining that matched the tampered lavender water. Sister Elizabeth's protective instincts overcame her careful composure when she saw Dr. Rowan's distress, and her movement toward him revealed the depth of their shared burden. Her whispered plea that he not blame himself for what had been an accident carried enough specificity to confirm Miss Marple's understanding of the true sequence of events. The digitalis had indeed been prepared with compassionate intent for Sister Agatha's suffering, but Sister Mildred's intervention during her month of silent observation had led to the tragic misadministration that resulted in her own death instead. The moral complexity of the situation became painfully clear as Dr. Rowan's carefully constructed façade crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence and his own conscience. His previous practice, his arrival in Little Wickham under circumstances he preferred not to discuss, his botanical knowledge and access to dangerous plants, all combined to create a picture of a man whose medical training and compassionate nature had convinced him that ending suffering sometimes took precedence over preserving life. The broken rosary told the story of Sister Mildred's final struggle to prevent what she saw as a mortal sin, while the opened hymn book reflected Dr. Rowan's desperate attempt to provide spiritual comfort in the aftermath of his unintended crime. As the morning progressed and the full implications became clear, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of good intentions leading to such devastating consequences. Inspector Bryce, faced with evidence that transformed his straightforward theft and murder case into a complex moral dilemma, found himself wrestling with questions of justice that extended far beyond the mechanical application of law. The case demonstrated once again how the most dangerous situations often arose not from evil purposes, but from the collision of different moral frameworks, each sincerely held but ultimately incompatible in their practical applications. The gathering concluded with Dr. Rowan's quiet request for a private conference with Inspector Bryce, his decision to provide a full account driven not by the pressure of evidence, but by the relief of finally being able to share the burden that had been crushing him since yesterday's tragic accident. Miss Marple, observing the interplay of guilt, compassion, and justice that would soon require official resolution, understood that the peaceful community of St. Agnes House would never quite recover its former innocence, though perhaps it might eventually find a deeper understanding of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most sacred institutions. The afternoon brought a curious calm to St. Agnes' house, as though the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath while waiting for truth to emerge from the tangle of accusations and misdirected suspicion that had clouded Sister Mildred's death. Miss Marple, having spent the morning hours in quiet contemplation of the previous night's revelations, now found herself studying the assembled company with the particular intensity she reserved for moments when all the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally ready to fall into their proper places. Inspector Bryce sat with renewed confidence in his case against Dr. Rowan, while the other suspects arranged themselves with the careful positioning of people who believed the worst had passed them by. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the gentle purposefulness of someone who understood that truth required careful handling, like delicate china that might shatter if grasped too firmly. "Inspector Bryce," she said with mild authority, "before any final charges are laid, I wonder if we might clarify a few small discrepancies that have been troubling me throughout this investigation." She moved to the center of the room, her knitting bag in hand, transforming the space into an impromptu theater where each participant would soon play their final role in this tragic drama. From her bag, she withdrew the red-headed pin wrapped carefully in her handkerchief, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the window. This little item, found near Sister Mildred's pew, initially seemed to implicate Mr. Pargeter through its traces of gilding size. Yet Sister Catherine confirmed it belongs to her lacework supplies, specifically one of 3 precious pins from Bruges that had mysteriously gone missing. Her mild blue eyes found Miss Blackshaw's face with gentle precision. "I believe you admired Sister Catherine's work yesterday morning, did you not? Such delicate insertions require the finest tools." Miss Blackshaw's response came with practiced composure, though her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her ever-present ledger. "I may have glanced at the lace display. Pins do have a way of rolling about, as anyone who has done needlework knows." Yet her voice carried a defensive edge that had not been there moments before, and Miss Marple noted how her eyes avoided the small object that seemed to glow accusingly in the afternoon light. The next test came with Miss Marple's gentle request for tea service, ostensibly to calm everyone's nerves during these difficult proceedings. "Ivy, dear, would you be so kind as to fetch the lavender water from the sacristy? The 3rd bottle, I believe, from the top shelf of the left cupboard." It was an absurdly specific instruction, deliberately incorrect, designed to invite correction from someone with intimate knowledge of the storage arrangements. Ivy looked puzzled. Mother Superior frowned, and then Miss Blackshaw's voice cut through the uncertainty with automatic precision. "Top right shelf, surely." The words died as she realized her error, a faint flush rising beneath her composed exterior. Miss Marple smiled with devastating gentleness. "Of course, how silly of me. Though I confess, the bottles can be confusing in that dim light, particularly when one has been tampered with so carefully." She produced 2 handkerchiefs from her bag, one scented with ordinary lavender, the other bearing the faint trace of peppermint that Dr. Haydock had detected in the poisoned bottle. As she passed them among the group, Miss Blackshaw's sharp recoil from the peppermint scent provided another telling reaction, the involuntary response of someone who recognized a carefully constructed piece of false evidence. The financial records provided the final, devastating blow to Miss Blackshaw's carefully maintained façade. Miss Marple consulted her own neat notes with the deliberate care of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. Sister Mildred's journal, before its unfortunate destruction, contained detailed observations about systematic discrepancies in the donation records. She had discovered, during her month of silent observation, that funds were being diverted through increasingly sophisticated accounting manipulations. The convent's medicinal garden had been used not only for legitimate purposes, but for extracting dangerous compounds, digitalis from the very foxgloves you supervised. The revelation of motive transformed suspicion into certainty. Miss Blackshaw had not simply stolen money. She had created an elaborate system of financial manipulation that required constant maintenance and absolute secrecy. Sister Mildred's growing awareness of these activities, documented in her private journal, had made her a deadly threat to someone whose entire life depended on maintaining the illusion of perfect propriety and fiscal responsibility. Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime revealed its calculated coldness. You knew Sister Mildred's habits intimately. Her afternoon lavender water, her customary pew, her growing suspicions about the financial irregularities. When Dr. Rowan's preparations for Sister Agatha provided the perfect opportunity, you seized it with chilling precision. The struggle in the chapel was real, but it was between Sister Mildred and you, not Dr. Rowan. You administered the poison in her lavender water, positioned her body to suggest peaceful prayer, and planted evidence to implicate others. The broken rosary told the final part of the story with heartbreaking clarity. Sister Mildred's desperate attempt to signal distress as the digitalis took effect, her fingers clutching the sacred beads while she struggled toward the bell rope that might have summoned help. The opened hymn book, the carefully planted false evidence, the systematic destruction of incriminating records, all revealed a mind that planned murder with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized years of financial fraud. When Miss Blackshaw's composure finally crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence and her own guilty conscience, her confession revealed the full extent of the desperation that had driven her to murder. Years of small thefts had grown into major embezzlement, while Sister Mildred's increasingly pointed questions had made discovery inevitable. The festival had provided the perfect opportunity, a public gathering where numerous suspects would deflect investigation, combined with intimate knowledge of routines and access to both poison and victim. As Inspector Bryce formally arrested the convent's trusted bursar, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of a crime committed to preserve reputation and security, yet which had ultimately destroyed both beyond any possibility of redemption. The morning brought Inspector Bryce back to St. Agnes' house with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed his case against Dr. Rowan was now unassailable. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying the assembled company with the particular attention she reserved for moments when obvious solutions masked more complex truths. The convent's small parlor had been arranged for what the inspector clearly intended as a final confrontation, with Dr. Rowan seated pale and hollow-eyed beside his medical bag, while the other suspects arranged themselves with the careful positioning of people who hoped to remain invisible to official scrutiny. Miss Marple, having spent the early hours in quiet contemplation of the evidence, now withdrew from her knitting bag a single sheet of paper covered with her neat handwriting. "Inspector Bryce," she said with gentle firmness, "before any charges are finalized, I wonder if we might clarify a small discrepancy that has been troubling me." She smoothed the paper carefully, her mild blue eyes taking in each face with the precision of someone who had learned to read character in the smallest gestures. "You see, I took the liberty of copying certain entries from the storage room ledger yesterday evening, and I'm afraid there's a rather significant inconsistency regarding the lavender water inventory." The reaction was immediate and telling. Miss Blackshaw, who had been maintaining her usual brisk composure, leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had been unexpectedly challenged. "I'm quite certain the inventory is perfectly accurate," she declared, but her voice carried a brittle edge that suggested less confidence than her words implied. Dr. Rowan looked up with confused hope, while Sister Elizabeth's hands tightened in her lap with obvious anxiety. Miss Marple consulted her notes with the deliberate care that had always characterized her approach to such moments. According to the ledger, 3 bottles of lavender water were recorded as being in stock for the festival, she continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension in the room. Yet when I mentioned this to Sister Catherine, she was quite certain that only 2 bottles had been prepared that morning. Most curious, don't you think, that someone would have such specific knowledge of a discrepancy that hadn't yet been officially discovered? The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of the convent bell marking the hour. Miss Blackshaw's face had gone quite pale, and her usual ready explanations seemed to have deserted her entirely. Inspector Bryce, recognizing the significance of this revelation, set aside his prepared case against Dr. Rowan and focused his attention on the convent's bursar with renewed interest. Miss Marple continued with the gentle inexorability that had always been her most effective weapon against deception. The poisoned lavender water showed such careful preparation, you see. The cork had been turned upside down to hide the telltale ring of dampness. The label had been repositioned to conceal tampering, and the cloudiness was so subtle that only someone with intimate knowledge of the proper appearance would notice the difference. She paused, allowing her words to settle before delivering the crucial observation. Most significantly, the peppermint scent that Dr. Haydock detected was clearly intended to implicate our young doctor. Yet the timing proves that Dr. Rowan was occupied with patients when the fatal dose was administered. The red-headed pin, when Miss Marple produced it, wrapped carefully in her handkerchief, provided the final piece of physical evidence. This pin, found near Sister Mildred's pew, bears traces of the same gilding size that was used to create false evidence of theft on the valuable frame. Yet it didn't come from Mr. Pargeter's restoration tools. It came from Sister Catherine's lace-making supplies, borrowed under the pretense of securing donation labels. Her eyes found Miss Blackshaw's face with gentle but implacable certainty. The same hands that had been handling the convent's financial records had also been preparing the evidence that would deflect suspicion from the real motive for murder. Miss Blackshaw's composure finally crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence and her own guilty conscience. The words came in a rush of defensive justification mixed with genuine remorse. Explanations about temporary borrowing from donation funds that had become permanent theft, about Sister Mildred's increasingly suspicious questions during her month of silent observation, and about the desperate calculation that had led to murder disguised as natural death. The digitalis had been extracted from the convent's own foxgloves using botanical knowledge, gained from years of maintaining the medicinal garden, then administered in the lavender water that Sister Mildred always took for calming her nerves during public events. The broken rosary told the final part of the story. Sister Mildred's last desperate attempt to signal that something was wrong, her fingers clutching the beads as the poison took effect while she tried to reach the bell rope to summon help. The opened hymn book, positioned to lead kindly light, had been Miss Blackshaw's attempt to suggest peaceful prayer rather than violent struggle, while the various planted evidence was meant to create a web of suspicion that would entangle everyone except the true murderer. As Inspector Bryce formally arrested Miss Blackshaw, her confession revealing the full extent of the financial manipulation that had driven her to such desperate measures, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of a crime committed to preserve reputation and security, yet which had destroyed both beyond any possibility of recovery. The convent's peace had been shattered not by outside malice, but by the corrosive effects of small deceptions that had grown into something monstrous, proving once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy and whose fall from grace seemed most impossible to imagine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the convent grounds as Miss Blackshaw was led away in Inspector Bryce's motor car, her final protests about temporary financial arrangements and misunderstood intentions fading into the distance like the last echoes of a badly tuned bell. The remaining inhabitants of St. Agnes House gathered in the refectory with the subdued air of people who had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about trust, virtue, and the capacity for deception that could flourish even within sacred walls. The silence that had once defined Sister Mildred's September vow now seemed to envelop the entire community, though this quiet carried the weight of shock rather than spiritual contemplation. Dr. Rowan, his face still bearing the pallor of a man who had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, approached Miss Marple with trembling hands and words of gratitude that seemed inadequate to express his relief. The revelation that his botanical expertise and nervous demeanor had been deliberately exploited to create false suspicion had shaken him profoundly, yet his distress extended beyond mere personal concern. His medical bag, when he opened it to retrieve legitimate pain medication for Sister Agatha, revealed the careful organization of someone whose compassionate nature remained intact despite the ordeal he had endured. The elderly nun's condition, now that the shadow of murder no longer obscured it, could be addressed with proper medical care and spiritual counseling rather than the desperate measures that had nearly been employed. Mr. Pargeter, his professional reputation restored and his indignation somewhat mollified by Inspector Bryce's formal apology, nonetheless departed with obvious relief and a promise to donate his expertise to the convent's future restoration needs without charge. The gold dust in his coat pocket, so recently damning evidence, was revealed to be exactly what he had claimed, the innocent residue of legitimate restoration work that had been twisted into false proof of criminal activity. His parting observation that valuable artifacts attracted dangerous attention from unexpected quarters carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Sister Elizabeth's role in the midnight destruction of Sister Mildred's journal remained a source of profound guilt, though Miss Marple understood the protective instincts that had motivated such desperate action. The nun's genuine belief that she was shielding Dr. Rowan from unjust persecution had led her to destroy evidence that might have revealed Miss Blackshaw's true motives much earlier. Her tearful confession to Mother Superior would require careful spiritual guidance, yet the experience had taught valuable lessons about the difference between loyalty and complicity. Ivy Simpkins, freed from the burden of suspicious circumstances that had made her behavior seem so questionable, revealed herself to be exactly what she had always appeared, a nervous young woman whose anxiety stemmed from natural timidity rather than guilty knowledge. Her greenish finger stains, so carefully scrutinized as evidence of botanical crime, proved to come from exactly the gardening tasks she had claimed, while her evasive behavior reflected nothing more sinister than embarrassment about her growing attachment to young Tom Pollard, who had remained steadfastly supportive throughout her ordeal. The financial irregularities that had provided the true motive for murder would require extensive reconstruction and external oversight to determine the full extent of Miss Blackshaw's embezzlement. Mother Superior's preliminary review suggested that the theft had been systematic and extensive, involving not only current donations but historical endowments that had been gradually diverted through increasingly sophisticated accounting manipulations. The convent's future financial stability would depend on recovering what could be traced and implementing safeguards against similar deceptions, a task that would require both practical expertise and spiritual resilience. Little Wickham struggled to reconcile the image of the austere, efficient Miss Blackshaw with that of a calculating murderer. The village's comforting illusion of impenetrable peace had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by an unsettling awareness of the hidden currents of resentment and desperation that could run beneath the most placid surfaces. Gossip, which had initially flourished with wild theories about foreign elements and mysterious societies, now settled into stunned silence, occasionally punctuated by whispers of disbelief that such deception could have flourished so long undetected. As Miss Marple prepared to depart St. Agnes' house, she reflected on the complex interplay of motives and circumstances that had created such a tragic outcome from what should have been a peaceful religious community. Sister Mildred's month of silence had indeed been more significant than anyone initially realized, providing her with the opportunity to observe and document the gradual accumulation of evidence that pointed toward financial misconduct. Her death had resulted not from dramatic confrontation, but from the calculated decision of someone who valued reputation and security above human life. The broken rosary, the tampered lavender water, the carefully planted false evidence, all had been elements in a scheme designed to deflect suspicion from the true motive while creating a web of confusion that would entangle innocent parties. Miss Blackshaw's intimate knowledge of the convent's routines, her access to financial records and medicinal supplies, and her ability to manipulate evidence had nearly succeeded in creating the perfect crime. foiled only by patient observation and gentle questioning that official investigations often overlooked. The tragedy at St. Agnes House served as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy, whose positions of responsibility provided both opportunity and camouflage for their activities. Communities built on trust were both stronger and more vulnerable than those governed by suspicion, requiring constant vigilance not against external threats, but against the gradual corruption that could develop when good intentions were compromised by human weakness and circumstances that seemed to offer no honorable alternatives. The evening mist settled over Little Wickham with the gentle finality that follows great storms, carrying with it the peculiar peace that comes when truth has replaced uncertainty, however painful that truth might prove to be. Miss Marple sat in the convent's small garden, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she watched the last light fade from the stained glass windows of the chapel where Sister Mildred had met her tragic end. The investigation was concluded. The machinery of justice had claimed its due. Yet she found herself contemplating the deeper lessons that such experiences invariably provided about the complexities of human nature and the unexpected forms that evil could assume within the most trusted institutions. Mother Superior had immediately begun the arduous task of rebuilding both the convent's shattered finances and its fractured trust. The extent of Miss Blackshaw's embezzlement proved far greater than initially suspected. A systematic depletion of resources spanning nearly 5 years, masked by meticulous yet fraudulent accounting that had diverted funds from charitable donations, maintenance reserves, and even the sisters' modest personal allowances. External auditors would be required, oversight committees established, and painful transparency implemented where comfortable privacy had once sufficed. The road to financial recovery would be long, but the remaining sisters had rallied with admirable resilience, their faith providing strength that secular institutions might have lacked. The village itself struggled to reconcile the image of the austere, efficient Miss Blackshaw with that of a calculating murderer. Mrs. Price Ridley's confident pronouncements about village virtue had given way to uncomfortable silence, while Colonel Weatherby's bluster faded into thoughtful reflection as Little Wickham grappled with the unsettling reality that evil was not always a foreign import, but could reside in the most familiar faces. The comfortable assumption about the inherent goodness of their world had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a more complicated understanding that would color future interactions with the wariness of experience. Dr. Rowan had departed quietly, his vindication bringing relief but also profound introspection about the dangerous path his compassion might have led him down. His confession to Inspector Bryce about past medical transgressions, mercy killings disguised as natural deaths, had cleared his conscience while ensuring he would face appropriate professional review. His final act was arranging proper palliative care for Sister Agatha, whose suffering could now be addressed through legitimate channels rather than the desperate measures that had nearly been employed. The botanical garden would be reorganized with proper safeguards, its medicinal plants protected from unauthorized extraction of dangerous compounds. Sister Elizabeth carried the burden of her midnight destruction of evidence with profound guilt, despite Miss Marple's compassionate intervention that had spared her legal consequences. Her protective instincts toward Dr. Rowan, while understandable, had nearly allowed the true murderer to escape justice. She had begun a period of intense spiritual reflection, seeking forgiveness not just from God, but from Sister Mildred's memory and the community she had unwittingly endangered. Her devotion to Sister Agatha's care provided a path toward redemption through selfless service. Young Ivy Simpkins and Tom Pollard found their tentative romance strengthened by shared ordeal, her nervous timidity gradually replaced by quiet confidence, while his protective concern matured into genuine affection. Their small love story became a gentle counterpoint to tragedy, a reminder that life found ways to blossom even in darkness's shadow. Mr. Pargeter returned to his antique business with reputation not merely restored but enhanced, viewing his profession with renewed ethical responsibility and perhaps even reverence for the historical treasures he handled. As Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of circumstances that had led to Sister Mildred's death, she marveled at the tragic irony that the nun's spiritual discipline of silence had provided the very opportunity for observation that made her dangerous to her killer. The careful documentation of financial irregularities, the quiet noting of suspicious activities, the patient accumulation of evidence, all had created a record that Miss Blackshaw desperately needed to suppress through calculated murder disguised as natural death during a public gathering where numerous suspects would deflect investigation. The method revealed both intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and sophisticated access to resources. The digitalis extracted from the convent's own foxgloves, administered in lavender water that Sister Mildred regularly consumed for calming her nerves, demonstrated careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The false evidence planted to implicate others, the red-headed pin borrowed from Sister Catherine's supplies, the peppermint-scented poison meant to suggest Dr. Rowan's involvement, the gilding traces designed to frame Mr. Purgator, showed cunning understanding of how investigations could be misdirected through apparent physical proof. Yet Miss Blackshaw's scheme contained the seeds of its own destruction in the very thoroughness that initially made it convincing. Each planted clue retained traces that connected it to internal rather than external sources, while the financial records she tried to protect revealed patterns of systematic theft that provided the true motive. The broken rosary told the final story with heartbreaking clarity. Sister Mildred's last conscious act, attempting to signal distress as poison took effect, her fingers clutching sacred beads while struggling toward the bell rope that might have summoned help. As morning sun broke through the mist shrouding the convent grounds, illuminating chapel windows with renewed brilliance, Miss Marple prepared to depart Little Wickham carrying the sobering reminder that the greatest dangers came not from obvious enemies, but from the gradual corruption of those who held positions of responsibility and trust. The tragedy at St. Agnes House demonstrated once again that communities built on faith possessed both special strength and particular vulnerability, requiring vigilance against the subtle temptations that could transform protectors into predators. Sister Mildred's silence had been broken by death, yet her final testimony would ensure that dedication to truth outlived both killer and deception.